Today I'd like to talk about a topic very near and dear to my heart. Corsetry. This is probably a bad idea. Buckle in, boys. This video is going to be a long one. We've all seen the egregiously inaccurate historical costumes in movies, the notorious metal bikini armor in video games, the imaginative but gratuitous fantasy and steampunk corsets. I find a lot of beauty in functionality. And to me, nothing exemplifies beautiful functionality better than corsets. Every element of the design, from the fabrics chosen, to the pattern, to the layers, to the lacing method, to the stitching, every part of it has a purpose and fulfills more than one function. I love corsets, and I love fantasy corsets. I just sometimes wish that the designers and artists would consider the subject a little more carefully. Not that I claim expertise in corsetry, but I have a fair bit of experience, and I can ponder ideas and bring you along for the ride. Fair warning, because there's just so much history, the following information will include many vast generalizations, and a heavy dose of my own personal opinions. The purpose of this study is to explore the function of different types of corsets, to help you decide which styles might be most appropriate to adapt into your fantasy world, or if they're even necessary at all. So, should your fantasy race wear corsets? Well, the short answer is it's your fantasy race, and they can wear whatever you want. But is it reasonable? Does it fit into your culture and feel justified? The long answer requires more data. In many ways, it will depend on the particulars of your race, their cultural values, lifestyles, available materials, and technological advancement. There are also a plethora of types of corsetry, and all of that ought to be taken into account. Bust support is in no way a modern concept. And if your culture is in even the early stages of developed civilization, with towns, trade, and basic sewing technology, then when developing clothing for the culture, bust support is maybe something that should be considered. Bust support can be achieved over or underneath the clothing. Roman bathhouse mosaics show imagery of women with simple flattening binders, strips of linen or leather wrapped tightly across the bust, which could have been worn discreetly beneath their loose dresses. In ancient Greece, another method was used. On top of the linen chiton, cords were wrapped underneath and across the bust, keeping it in place more like a harness, though evidence suggests that both of these methods might have been primarily used by women engaged in sporting or hunting activities, and not necessarily worn daily. Another example from antiquity, in a neighboring region, are the Minoans of Crete. Tight, waist-cinching corsets like that worn by the fertility goddess were not meant to contain the bust, but display. Tiny waists became desirable, and highly decorative cinctures were worn by both men and women for a time. In Europe, for the next several centuries, a variety of methods were used for bust support. They ranged from tightly fitted supportive kirtles and front-lacing cots, which relied on a combination of strategic seam placement, lacings, stiffened fabrics, and sometimes light boning to do the job. There are a variety of vests, including the Norse apron dress, which can provide support if close-fitting. There were also medieval belts, double-wrapped or wide and high-waisted. Any belt worn high on the waist would have provided a measure of support similar to that of the Greek harness. The earliest known predecessor to a modern bra is the Langberg bra, which I have already covered in more depth in a separate video. It was notable as a distinctly supportive garment, made from linen with separate cups, designed to contain but also give shape to the bust, rather than flattening it, as many other early garments did. Early in the Tudor era, a flat, conical-shaped torso became fashionable, and to achieve this silhouette, upper-class women began to wear what were called boned bodies, or a pair of bodies. They flattened the torso, pushing the hips down and the chest up. These bodies were made of layers of stiffened fabric, usually linen, with rows of stitching containing bones. At first, the bones were reed or cane, but they soon began to shift to the highly superior baleen, or whalebone. I believe that these bodies were usually made with attached skirts, but by the Elizabethan era, examples can be found of fully separate pieces. During the 17th century, boned bodies grew in popularity, and they do not seem to have been determined to be strictly underclothing just yet. They were sometimes plain and simple and worn underneath elaborate dresses, or sometimes they were trimmed and worn as overbodices, with elaborate interchangeable triangular stomachers. Sometimes they even had detachable sleeves, and sometimes the simple functionality was combined with the elaborate dress and became a boned bodice. During the 18th century, boned bodies evolved into stays, and by that point they were a cultural mainstay, worn by women of every rank. Stays gave a framework to the gowns and jackets, they provided bust and back support, and a degree of protection from the elements to the average working woman. They were made for little girls and boys to promote good posture. They could be made specifically for men or women to help with a variety of bone and muscular diseases, which medical science of the time was not equipped to handle. They provided upper-class women with the ability to conform their body shape to the current fashion, and hide their bodily imperfections beneath layers of linen, whalebone, and padding. Stays reigned supreme until a twist in history almost erased them from existence. That twist was the French Revolution. The French Revolution ushered in absolutely massive cultural shifts, clearly reflected in the complete overhaul of fashion. It was a time when wearing stays and panniers made you look like Marie Antoinette. And no one wanted to look like Marie Antoinette. Aristocracy was out of style, and Grecian ideals were in. Regency-era fashion swung to an opposite extreme, with women attempting to look as much like Greek statues and columns as possible. Stays were minimized and shortened, and used as bust support only. And some women stopped wearing any supportive garments. Early Regency women were almost the hippies of their day. Slender ladies were like, I want to be natural and real. Stays are so last century. Viva la revolution! Free the peasantry! Free the boobs! And the curvaceous women were like, you do you. I'm gonna go invent something that actually works. And so the larger women took the new simplified stays design and just made it longer. Instead of the distinctive, stiff, conical shape, these new stays were designed to lift the bust, but flatten and smooth the curves of the torso and hips, to appear more slender beneath their narrow dresses. These stays would have a long wooden busk up the front, maintaining the desirable straight shape, but the rest of the stays were only lightly boned, and whalebone was largely substituted with cording. The Regency era is actually a great place to research if you're looking for more minimalist corset ideas. There are many interesting types of stays that were used during this time period. Wrapped stays, bust bodices, cupped stays, very short bra-like stays, but the fall of stays was brief. Soon they were back with a vengeance, evolving quicker than ever in the 19th century. It started with the long corded stays worn primarily by larger women during the height of the Regency. Long corded stays became fashionable, and soon all women wore them. The early 19th century saw the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, and new technology and materials allowed for innovative new designs. It is also during this time period that stays began to be called corsets for the first time. However, this is nebulous, and I'm not sure when the vernacular fully transitioned from stays to corsets. But a new corset came into style in the 1840s. This one was cut with a series of sloping panels, all fitting together to create a shape with more extreme curves. This is also the time period in which steel began to overtake baleen for corset boning. Which is a good thing because the whales were about gone. With steel boning, corsets could be made lighter and stronger, but by sacrificing a bit of flexibility. Whalebone had amazing properties, being made from keratin. When worn against the body, the heat and moisture produced would soften the whalebone and mold it to your shape, meaning that whalebone stays would become more comfortable and personalized as they were broken in. Steel does not have this ability, so although steel-boned corsets could maintain their shape with fewer bones, they were more rigid and restrictive. Steel also brought other innovations. Steel eyelets allowed the corsets to be laced tighter, and separating steel busks made corsets much quicker and simpler for women to put on themselves. Corsets also began to be produced in factories, which made them cheaper and more accessible for the masses. But factory-made corsets often used steam molding and other techniques that were unavailable to the home seamstress. So at this point, corsetry started to become part of modernized consumer-based culture, as you could simply go out and buy a new corset rather than spending the weeks or months it might take to hand sew one yourself. Victorian styles evolved quicker than ever, the waist lengthening, shortening, lengthening again. The bustle era brought the S-curve, the natural form, the pigeon breast. Late Victorian-era corsets were particularly beautiful, made from brightly colored silks with complementary boning channels, laces, embroidery, and flossing. As the century wore on, however, with women leading more active lives, new corsets were experimented with, many of them using elastic to replace the functions of lacing and bones. In the earliest parts of the 20th century, a full bust was desirable, and corsets began slipping lower and lower down the chest. Women wore supportive bust bodices, designed with fluff or padding for the smaller women, and soon corsets were being designed only for waist and hip shaping, and to hold up the garters. With the need for corsetry already in decline, the first bra, patented by Mary Phelps Jacobs, helped to seal its fate. It had a few last hurrahs, but soon became optional attire for the first time since the Regency. During the 1920s, flat, boxy bodies were in vogue, and sometimes tight but lightweight garments were worn to flatten the chest and hips. When this trend died, updated versions of the brassiere came back, paired with the sad descendants of the corset, garter belts. This pairing continued to be used to this day, with elements and functions slowly stripped away and replaced by elastic. The old body-shaping corsets did not 100% disappear, though they were relegated to special occasion wear. Nowadays, the only trace we have of their existence are the highly elasticated shapewear, and if you can find a modern corset, it will be poorly fitting and uncomfortable. And all bets are that it will be black or white, wedding attire or kink attire, and thus died that noble construction. Okay, that took longer than I was planning. So, as I hope you understand by now, the primary purpose of corsets was not to make you look skinny. Rather, it was to give you the currently idealized proportions. Corsets were the great equalizers. Large women could minimize their waist, pear-shaped women could enhance their bust, Apple-shaped women could pad their hips, slender women could artificially fill out their bust and hips. Corsets gave women the ability to conceal their true form, and to exaggerate their figure however they wanted. And most men didn't care for that, because they never knew what they were getting. Kind of the same way men complain today about women who wear too much makeup and then look like a totally different person once it comes off. Which brings me to another point. The patriarchy. There's this idea nowadays that men were cramming women into tiny corsets in order to keep them tame. That is just absurd. After 300 years, men got used to corsets, and it might be shocking to see a woman publicly without one, but on a whole, they hated all of this nonsense. The ridiculous, unnatural, exaggerated shapes women turn their bodies into? Just look at the caricatures. They drew the corseted women disproportionate and hideous. It wasn't supposed to be flattering. It was an exasperated plea for women to stop this madness. But here's the thing, and this is my opinion, but I will stand by it to my dying breath. Corsets are fun. Okay, on average, men have more muscle density than women. Women have more fat. Scientific fact. But all of that fat is squishy and can be rearranged. I love corsets because it is just so much fun to look in the mirror and see your body in a completely different shape. I believe that women throughout history squeeze their body into all of these different shapes because they enjoy doing it. Sometimes women wear uncomfortable things because it makes them feel good. Who says they're doing it for the men? And speaking of comfortability, there are also myths perpetuated by actresses and dumb BuzzFeed articles about how terribly painful corsets are to wear. If your corset is painful, you're doing it wrong. For one, corsets were never worn against the skin, much to the chagrin of fantasy costumers everywhere. Corsets were always lined with a soft, washable cotton or linen shirt, and that makes a huge difference. Also, corsets were made individually to fit one person, and a well-fitted corset can be quite a comfortable experience. Just think about history. Lower-class women had to work, had to keep moving, and couldn't wear corsets or stays that were tight enough to prohibit their activity, but the type of work they did was different. Historically, men did the more highly strenuous work, women did more consistent, paced work. In primitive societies, men hunted, women gathered. On the frontier, the men chopped the wood while the women cooked. It's just the way it was. And women's physical needs were different. Corsets aren't the best for strenuous exercise, but they do provide good back support if you're stooping over a pot boiling laundry all day. Corsets do affect your breathing, but not by a lot. I actually find them more comfortable than modern elastic garments. It's hard to describe, but with elastic you can stretch it. So it's like your body is constantly fighting to push the elastic out with every breath you take. With corsets, it's like your body tries to push, realizes it's not going to win, and redirects your breathing to other parts of your lungs. Your breathing shifts to the top portion of your lungs, and you breathe a bit shallower, but this doesn't cause a problem unless you decide to run distance. But what about the 16-inch waist? Okay, other people have done much better videos on this myth. But long story short, tight lacing was a thing practiced by a very small minority of women, but it always was a tiny number, as with any other extreme body modification you can think of. The average waist was 24 to 26 inches, not that far off from average measurements today. Also, Edwardian photoshopping was totally a thing, so don't even believe the photographic evidence. Men and children did wear some kinds of corsetry, but that partly depends on your definition of a corset. As I've already mentioned, all children wore flat stays for their posture. The boys would eventually age out of wearing them, the girls would just transition to more adult stays as they hit puberty. Men did, at different points in history, wear stiffened doublets and such, which did fulfill the purpose of giving their body a more desirable shape. Starting with certain Regency dandies, there was a trend for men to wear full-on waist-cinching corsets. This trend did persist throughout the Victorian era, but it soon became a subject of ridicule, so men hid it. Now, I've mostly been covering European history, because that is my primary area of costume interest and thus what I know the most about. But there were other bust support solutions in other cultures historically. Indian women did, and sometimes still do, wear short fitted bodices, which they wrap their saris over. We don't normally think of these bodices in the same terms as a bra or a corset, but that's kind of the point. You don't have to have something that looks like a traditional corset in order to fulfill the same function of support and silhouette. In Japan, long, straight torsos were preferred, and the wrapping method and layers of kimono and obi do not minimize the waist, but build up a strong, straight silhouette, hiding any natural curves. There are other examples from other cultures, but I'm not as familiar with them. If you are building a fantasy race and basing elements off of a specific historical culture, that might be a good place for you to start your research. One final topic, but an important one to the fantasy genre: corsets as armor. On the face of it, I approve of this concept wholeheartedly. Some people don't do it particularly well, but But I actually already see corsets as a type of armor. Women had different needs historically. They might not have been dressing for battle, but corsets served them nonetheless. You know, history was a harsh, cruel place for men and women. It's another reason I don't see the patriarchy as responsible for corsets. If anything, I see corsets as women's protection from it. Imagine a woman lives in a society where her value comes primarily from her inheritance and her ability to birth children. She is judged by her body. Are you healthy? Are you wealthy? What better defense does she have than to hide her body behind outlandish fashion? And that's not even mentioning the actual physical protection women's clothing provided. At a time when assault was commonplace and there was very little the law could or would do about it, women were literally armoring themselves every day when they got dressed. Thick layers of corsetry, steel boning, layers and layers of petticoats, caged hoop skirts. Women were making themselves physically harder to get at. Although that is probably not what you were imagining when I said corsets as armor. Okay, leather, forest adventurer bodice armor. I say feasible. In that context, it would not be about fashion, but support, and would only be laced tight enough to do that job. No tight lacing on a battlefield. The garments would need to be stiff and maintain their shape, which a thick leather would achieve nicely. The seam placement would give the leather convenient places to flex, so keep the body shape and movements in mind when designing such a bodice. The more area of skin you cover, the more protective it will be, but also the more restrictive. So a lot would depend on what kind of weapon or fighting style you're working with. How can you offer the most protection, but leave flexible areas needed for the arm, shoulder, hip, and waist movements? It should also not be worn directly on the skin. There should be at least one layer beneath, but that is exactly how men's armor works. So, finally, back to the topic. Should your fantasy race wear corsets? First question, do they need bust support? Is your fantasy race inhumanly tall and slender with nothing to support? Or are they curvy? Are they fairly primitive? It is likely that wrapped bandages were used for most of human history, even if we don't have record of it. It is the simplest and most obvious solution. If your society is just building their first villages, maybe this is the furthest advancement they've made. If the society is more advanced, reasonably they might have developed something more complex. What materials are available to them? Leather, silk, a linen substitute? What simple shapes could they start from? Remember, a supportive garment does not have to be elaborate. A stiffened bodice can suffice, or anything that is slightly tight in strategic areas. Pay attention to those strategic areas, because the resulting shape will depend on it. Is it simply wrapped tight? This will cause most of the support to be suspended from above the bust, which will flatten and pull down. If it is tight beneath the bust, this will open many shaping possibilities, but it will need to be supported somehow. Logically, the best places for this to rest are the shoulders as straps, or for it to rest on the hips and be supported from the base, making shoulder straps extra supportive, but not necessary. Will the corsets be worn beneath the clothing as a purely functional garment, or will they be worn above the clothing and be decorative? Or will they merge with the clothing, creating complex, stiffened, decorative clothing that is incredibly valuable and time-consuming to make? What is their level of technological advancement? Do they have bone needles or steel, homespun fabric or textile mills? Are the corsets made by hand or wholesale? Are they made by home seamstresses or is it a specialized trade? What stiffening materials can they use? Glue to stiffen fabric? Quilting? Do they have trees for wooden boning? Do they have whales for whalebone? Or some other monstrous Cthulhu monster that produces slabs of keratin? Do they have metallurgy for steel boning? What about elastic? What is the clothing like? What is the idealized body shape? Would a corset be useful to support a silhouette? What type of silhouette? And what type of corset? Pay attention to the shapes of history, but also the shapes you've already come up with that might be unique and not perfectly represented in history. Different eras in corsetry were defined by the silhouette, and the silhouettes were all about proportion and balance, creating optical illusions through strategic exaggeration. So pay attention to the overall effect the corset will give the finished result. Do you have a class system? Does it indicate a certain status to wear a certain corset? Are corsets only worn by the upper class? Or is there a variation the working class could use for more freedom of movement? What kind of work or activity do the corset wearers engage in? And how might they adapt their corsets to that? Is there any individual group that might wear some kind of corset traditionally? Royalty? Religious leaders? Performers? And what are the goals the corset wearers are all trying to achieve? Is it about looks, support, protection? Can you work in all three? Well, I hope this helps you get started. Have fun!